New Hampshire in our office in the upstairs.
Good, because we're sort of neighbors. I live
Oh,
north of
yeah.
Boston.
Yeah,
We're
you're
not
in
far
Salisbury.
away.
Are you in Newburyport or Salisbury?
I am just north of Boston.
Okay. Yeah.
But we're
Yeah.
we're now live, and I just want to introduce you properly.
Okay.
And first of all, thank my friend Tia Levings for recommending you.
Yeah.
What is your relationship with Tia, who we've interviewed here on this podcast?
Yes, Tia and I were on a panel together about a year and a half ago, and we met in preparation for that and became friends. And she gave me the opportunity to read and blurb her book. And
Yeah.
so, and as you read in my book, I was kind of adjacent to
Yes, I
her
understand.
as
There's a
well. So,
connection. And the thing
yeah.
is, we always ask this, and we'll ask you at the end of this. So I might as well mention this up front. Please don't ring off, as it were. And when I go away and say goodbye, you stay on for a minute to talk to my
Okay.
producer, Ernie,
Sure.
because we always ask at the end of each podcast conversation, hey, is there someone you think we should talk to as well?
Sure.
And it can be someone well known or not well known, or with a book or no book, but we always find that our guests seem to be our best lead to another guest. And
Yeah.
Tia Levings brought us you, so we're looking for you to tell us who to talk to after we're done here
Absolutely. I'm
today.
happy to do that. Sure.
Yeah. So let me first introduce you properly here. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I am Frank Schaeffer, and my guest today is Melanie Brooks. And Melanie teaches creative nonfiction in the MFA program at Bay Path University, and I hate these reading things. We're going to actually find out who you are in the university, and the MFA program at Western Connecticut State University, and professional writing at Northeastern University. I wish you were less accomplished. There'd be less to say.
Thank
It's
you.
like, I would rather just say Melanie Brooks wrote a book and we all hope it's good, but we're going to do more than that. Melanie is the author of A Hard Silence, One Daughter's, let me just say, remap. No.
One Daughter Remaps.
Yeah, One Daughter Remapped Family, Grief, and Faith When HIV/AIDS Changes It All. Did I read that subtitle right?
Yes, One Daughter Remaps Family, Grief, and Faith When HIV.
Yes, and I read the book on Kindle because I
Mhm.
always take notes and can refer to them. Do you have a hard copy of your book handy?
I do.
Do that. Hold it up,
Yeah.
because I'm going to be reading from the Kindle, but I really want to promote this book. It's beautifully written, and we're going to talk a lot about it. So as I mentioned, Tia referred you to us, and another little boilerplate here. Please subscribe right now on YouTube and on In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer at Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack, It Has to Be Said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. Okay, so I read the book, and I really appreciated it. And what I would like to do is to sort of set it up with the boilerplate off the cover, just to introduce you a little more. And then I want to jump into specific quotes from the book.
Sure.
And using those, I want you to tell your story. In other words, I'm not going to retell your story, but I'm going to dive in and out of actual quotes that I think will guide us through that, if that sounds good to you, Melanie.
Sure. Absolutely.
Okay, so in the mid-1980s, Canada's worst public health disaster was unfolding. Catastrophic mismanagement of the country's blood supply allowed contaminated blood to be knowingly distributed nationwide, infecting close to 2,000 Canadians with HIV. Among them was Melanie Brooks' surgeon father, who, after receiving a blood transfusion during open heart surgery in 1985, learned he was HIV positive. And that sort of sets it up. And then the book itself tells that story, but rather than retelling that, I just want to dive in and actually use some of the quotes from the book.
Sure.
And we'll go from there. So let me first read from something early in the book where you say, I tell my story because there was no space into which my family and I fit as we dealt with AIDS outside any recognized group. And then you go on in a different place and say, in reflecting on this narrative against the backdrop of COVID-19, interesting connection, I see an ongoing chance for us to do better for those who have suffered the greatest coronavirus losses. And of course, coronavirus infected people for a long time were also untouchable. I just mentioned that on the way by, and we were similarly afraid. And of course, both the illnesses are something to be afraid of. And then we'll jump to Randy died from complications related to AIDS after a period of prolonged illness. And that's the story of somebody whose funeral you attended. And your father at that time, I believe, was slumped in the pew and alive. And
My father attended it. I did not. So
yeah,
that
he
scene is
attended
an
it.
imagined scene of him because
Yeah,
I was
you're imagining
there.
that.
Yeah,
And in the final 2 years of his life, Randy had become one of the most recognizable faces of a national tragedy, and that was Canada's tainted blood scandal. Between 1980 and 1985, close to 2,000 Canadians, most from within the hemophiliac community, were infected. And of course, by the way, as you know, Melanie, the same thing happened in the United Kingdom. They had an
right.
enormously infected, and I think France had a similar disaster because
Well,
they did
yeah,
not.
and the United Kingdom's report just came out at the end of May, and I actually wrote an op-ed for the Toronto Globe and Mail about that,
Yeah,
because it resonated. They found out so many years after
yeah.
the same story that we experienced,
And
it
what's so
that
interesting in
long.
listening to BBC Radio 4 News, which I do every day quite religiously, I followed that story and was stunned by the time gap between the mistakes they made, then admitting the mistake, then
Right.
doing anything about it, then an investigation. What was the, just go to the UK for a minute. What
Sure.
was the time gap between the infection and deaths and illness and destruction of whole families, and then alienation from their community because, of course, hey, you have AIDS, you're a pariah,
Yeah.
untouchable. You have that great quote in your book of William F. Buckley saying they all ought to be tattooed,
Mhm.
and so forth. And because the British case and the Canadian case sort of overlap, I don't know whether they overlap in terms of the same time reference. Were
They
they
really
happening at the
do. I
same
mean, it
time?
was right around the same, it was early 80s that it was happening in the UK as well. And, just kind of in thinking about time frame, the investigation and report that happened in Canada culminated in a report in 1997, and
Yeah,
it took until 2024 for
yeah,
that same kind of report to be
yeah,
released in the UK. And so those families were fighting for justice and
yeah.
fighting to have their stories heard for 40 years.
And fighting a stigma.
Exactly.
Oh, they have to be gay or they must have been promiscuous. And of course, the stigma itself is unjust because being gay has nothing to do with, quote, deserving to be tattooed, as William F. Buckley
Right.
would have done. Um, I'm going to read quotes as we go through and talk about them, and I hope that draws you out. But I just want to mention something, first of all, to people who are listening. I just want to say, first of all, Melanie is a beautiful and lyrical and moving writer. I interview a lot of authors, and some of them have something tremendous to say, but they don't pretend to be writers. They just have a story to tell. Others are writers. And then once in a while, you hit a book that's a gem. And your book is a gem because
Wow.
you are a real writer. And it is lyrical, it is moving, it is tremendous. And besides your story, you're kind of telling the story of every disenfranchised group or person, every alienated person who's cast out. I really felt that. And I
Yeah.
also felt that the kind of double injustice of AIDS being misunderstood, hemophiliacs getting AIDS from blood transfusions when they weren't part of the hated groups, yet being labeled as such.
Right.
And then you have to go to another level and say, well, why should have anybody been hated anyway? So I found 3 or 4 big threads running through your story.
Sure.
It's a lot more than your story.
Well,
And
and
so you,
it's really way beyond,
yeah,
dad's story.
yeah,
What happened to my dad kind of forms the backdrop of the
yeah.
story, but it's really a story about living with silence and living with secrecy and not being able to talk about our pain and suffering,
Yeah,
and
and I was
the
amazed
impact
and
it has.
interested in passages of your book where your family itself is sort of creeping around it on 2 levels as I read it. And then I'm going to quit talking. You will do most talking on this, but I'm excited because I read the book. So forgive me for burbling on about it.
No, please go ahead.
But I found so many things in the book that mirrored my own experience of life as a human, as a father, a grandfather, someone who's done some living, dealt with some illness in my life and in other people's. And that was the sort of unmentionable silence. You don't, you know someone in your family that has cancer, but they're not telling anybody, or this or that. There are so many experiences that you relate through this book that are part of a landscape of most of our lives. And one of them here, I just want to read from your book. You say, fear of its stigma, particularly within their evangelical community, where vocal condemnation of people infected with HIV and their, quote, simple lifestyles was the norm that prompted that silence. So let's kind of, in terms of this book and your retelling of that story, let's just start there, because that overlaps so much of my own experience. And of course, Tia Leving's experience that we interviewed her about in terms of her book, being raised in that kind of purity movement and so on. It's something I know something about.
Sure.
Let's begin simply with that angle. It's a sub angle in the book, and that is the kind of evangelical background and the lack of the ability to deal with compassion with the AIDS community and the people infected, whether it was like your dad or whether it was the gay community, and the kind of thing that harshness of William F. Buckley saying AIDS sufferers should be tattooed in a kind of a punitive way. That's all really one story. And I don't know if you'd like to start there, but I would really like to discuss that with you.
Well, I do want to say, first of all, Frank, that it's such a pleasure to talk to you, because your work has, resonated with me on many levels as well. I read Crazy for God a number of years ago. I've read a lot of kind of, other things that you've written, and I think we've kind of landed in the same kind of liminal in between space,
Yes.
when it comes to our faith. And so I grew up in an evangelical Christian family. My father's father was a Baptist minister. So my mother's parents, my grandparents, you talk about your mother having, her parents were missionaries in China. My grandfather's parents were missionaries in China. I'm sure they probably overlapped at some point. And, so evangelical Christianity was, the culture and life that I was born into, and a big part of my upbringing. And, I wasn't in kind of the deepest of fundamentalist groups. I think partly because my dad was a man of science, he was a surgeon. He also was a very intelligent and thoughtful man. I think that, he was able to kind of give us a little bit of space from the deeply fundamentalist and conservative viewpoints, but certainly we grew up in a conservative Christian family. And so, Jerry Falwell and, Pat Robertson and, William F. Buckley Jr., these big voices from the evangelical community were among the first to be condemning, people who had been infected with HIV. And so it was those voices that were kind of steering the Christian community's response to HIV and AIDS. Jerry Falwell called it, God's wrath in full force on homosexuals. Pat Buchanan, same thing. These voices. Pardon me, I think I said Pat Robertson before. Pat Buchanan. These very strong voices that had a lot of clout, and so it created not only kind of a culture of intolerance, right? But it created a culture of fear and stigma where there was such distrust that, for my dad, it was, how does he, reveal this illness that he's, been infected with, and just the fear of how people would respond, what people would think about him. And there was a lot of danger for our family at the time. Canada was talking about quarantining AIDS patients and their families. There was, fear of, my school would have had to know, or all of our schools would have had to know. We might have been separated from the other children, So my dad really wanted to maintain as much safety as he could for us in the midst of this. And so he decided it would be a secret. But being part of the evangelical community was a big part of that secrecy.
Of that secretiveness. And one thing that you mentioned in the book, and I've got the page written down somewhere, but it struck me sort of peripheral to the main story. But again, as a, as a married husband, father, grandfather, there are things that just sort of cut in. And one of them was the fact that your father had been undiagnosed for a while. And of course, you were wondering later, why your mother was not infected. And it was quite
Right.
some time before he knew what he had. And then kind of, I guess you could use the word, mercifully, miraculously, whatever, your
Yeah.
mother did not get infected. I forget which part of the book was it, but that jumped right out, like all these things you don't think of.
Right.
Um, oh yeah, of course, if that happened. And then this kind of double whammy on this fatal diagnosis, because it was always fatal at that point, combined with, but I'm not the kind of person you hate, who you think is being judged by God, and then that's unjust in itself. There's just so many layers to the.
Well, and there were so many, I mean, there were so many families whose story played out very differently than ours,
Yes,
that one of the spouses was infected with HIV, and before they knew they were infected, they
yeah,
infected their partner,
of
some
course,
infected children, and so it was 8 months between when my dad had his surgery and when he found out his diagnosis. And
yeah,
so there's no reason, scientifically, that my mother should not have been infected.
sure,
She wasn't,
yeah.
and that's kind of
One,
a gift
there was
that
a
we
line in your
received in the
book.
midst of it.
Yeah, this isn't apropos of the big story, but I must say I was so touched by this. Like so many other daughters thinking about their fathers. As a little girl, I believed mine invincible. Nothing could alter the all-powerful, all-knowing largeness of who he was. I just love that. I was talking about what a wonderful writer you are, and that line really brought tears to my eyes. As someone who just cooked lunch for my three youngest grandchildren literally 2 minutes ago.
Oh.
Thankful that I got up early to finish reading your book, by the way, and that ran in here and they had their friends over from next door. And of course, I'm 72 now. I just had that birthday, and I try to be that invincible grandfather.
Right.
And of course, the reality is that, this invincible person who looms large in their life, they'll grow up someday and understand in proportion to the rest of life that I'm just a human.
Right.
And but that little child view that you put on the page there in one simple line, you're such a good writer. I mean, it really stopped me
Thank you.
thinking, okay, that's such a wonderful place to start a book about the loss of a father, and who he was to you as a child. And then of course we're reading a book by a grown-up, but you didn't lose that. I don't know, I just wanted to mention, I just thought that was
Thank
so
you.
fantastic.
Thank
Um,
you.
Let me go on to another quote here. What I dubbed my psychological freefall started with a rejection letter. This is off on another subject, but it's a window into who you are. 2 months earlier, from a Master of Fine Arts program to which I had applied, a program I'd hoped would be a salve for an inexplicable restlessness in my mind and body and be the excuse I needed to write. And I'm going to ask you one question related to this. Did that also have something to do with the fact that, coming from that evangelical background, you felt yourself to sort of be an outsider and you're looking for an into a bigger world? I don't want to read more into it than that, but that line was so familiar to me, of the kind of things that I've been looking for the last 72 years, having grown up in that evangelical subculture. And it's like a rejection from the big world is sort of like, well, of course, they don't want me because, I'm always going to be an outsider. I mean, that's the
Right.
way I've spent my life feeling.
Yeah. Well, I think, we grow up in the evangelical Christian church, and there's this certain, kind of very like things are truthful and certain and real and true,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
I think when our lives are rocked by uncertainty, which is certainly what happened, with my dad's diagnosis, that suddenly that story didn't fit into, the story I had grown up believing and
yeah,
thinking,
yeah,
that I think from that point on, there's always kind of that searching that
yeah,
happens. Like, how
yeah,
do we make sense of what we've been brought up to believe, when what we've been brought up to believe does not align with the way our life is playing out, and how do we find ourselves, how do we connect? And so I always felt, I mean, partly because we were carrying the secret, we had to carry the secret for 10 years.
yeah,
My dad had no idea. I mean, he was at the height of his medical career. He thought he would be dead within months after
yeah,
his diagnosis. He had no idea that he could live with this disease for as long as he did, but we carried
yes,
the secret for 10 years. And so having that boundary always created a sense of being on the outside,
yeah,
that we were carrying this thing that was shameful, that we weren't allowed to talk
sure.
about. that, and so it always created that sense of being an outlier and where do I fit? And I think that that followed me, long after my dad died,
Yeah,
that
I
feeling.
totally understand. I get that. And one thing I was wondering about the time, um, I was going to say time zone. No, we're not traveling. The time difference between, we're all on the East Coast here. What I found out, um, in terms of secretiveness imposed on your family by the fact that he had had this blood transfusion. And of course, he wasn't being secretive about his health in general, because obviously he would tell people, I'm going in for heart surgery, I'm
Right.
having a thing, because he's a doctor.
Yeah.
Then you come to this witchcraft trial, as it were. Oh, you must be one of them. What happened at the end of that 10-year period? Just tell that story a little bit about how, were you behind the curve on when AIDS became more acceptable, as in less of a stigma, or did you just finally, I'd like to hear that arc, because you're secretive about it and you finally say something. You're secretive not about some wicked thing he's doing, but something that's being wickedly done to you.
Right.
I just think that's such an interesting loop, if you want to go into
Yeah.
that a little bit.
Well, I often say this when I talk about the book. Like, I did not reveal the secret of my dad's HIV in the writing of this book. My mom and dad actually published a book 6 months before my dad died
Yeah,
that ended up on, the bestseller list in Canada for a little while. And so his HIV status was known by the
sure.
time he died in 1995. But the irony was I had already gotten married and moved away. And so when that big reveal happened,
Yeah,
and they received a tremendous amount of support, which kind of
yes.
demonstrated that maybe they could have gotten that support sooner,
Earlier, yeah.
but I was distanced from that. I was
Yeah,
not part of that. And so I carried the secret close. I rarely talked about it to
yeah.
people for almost 20 years after my dad died. And it wasn't until I started writing this book that I really started digging
Talking
into,
about it.
yeah, talking about it and trying to figure out, what did that mean? What happened to me when HIV happened to my dad? That
Yeah.
was really kind of the question that I was asking in this book.
Yeah, because you talk about it in the book, but I just want to get the date straight. Excuse me.
Mhm.
How old were you when you learned he had HIV?
I
What
was
age? What
13. I
you
was
were?
13. Yeah.
Yeah, 13. So that's an
Yeah.
age when things matter.
Yeah,
You
it
feel
is.
it. So
Right.
you're
Right.
13 and you're 23 before they reveal.
Mhm.
And then another, how many years go by before you want to talk about it
Almost
in this book?
20. Almost 20.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so explain that 20 years. You're grown up now. HIV is less of a stigma, but you are so used to living in this sort of double vision world where there's the real life of your family and illness that you're keeping secret. Talk about the struggle to finally come clean in your own writing, as it were, and to lay this out on the table,
Right.
and what that process was and how that has made you feel or not since
Sure.
then, because this is a relatively new book.
Yep.
It didn't get published. I forget the pub date on it, but
It
it's
was
pretty.
September 2023.
Yeah,
So
so we're right, this has not
we're
been out
almost
there a
20
long
years.
time.
Yeah.
Just talk about that personal story of a writer and a person and a human and a daughter who learned something at 13 and keeps it secret for the better part of
Sure.
33 years.
Yeah. Well, I think, one of the things I realized, when you're living an experience like that, you're just
Yeah,
living it, right? Like you're just doing
yes,
what needs to be done. We continued
yes,
living, we continued our lives, and then my dad died, and that was a devastating and deep loss in my life. But at the same
yeah,
time, I had to kind of keep moving forward and keep living. And what I did was I kind of boxed up the experience of that 10 years of silence and all of
mm,
the fear and emotions that I was never able to process or talk about then. I boxed up a lot of the grief of the loss of my dad and kind of carried it with me. And it was kind of this burden that got heavier and heavier as I
mm,
kind of kept moving forward. I really thought when I started writing this book when I started an MFA program. I
hmm,
really thought I knew what the story was that I was writing. I thought I really understood it. And I realized very early on that I had no idea what the story
yeah,
really was because I had just kind of carried it. But what kind of prompted it, you read a little bit earlier, and that was a scene in therapy. I write a number of scenes,
Yes. Yeah.
my therapeutic journey, because that, not purposefully, but I
Yeah.
started therapy kind of right around the same time I started writing, and not because I thought the two would go hand in hand,
Sure.
but I can't imagine having done one without the other.
Yeah. No, I
I
understand.
needed that therapeutic support. And so I write it into the book because it's such a part of the journey for me of
Yeah.
unpacking this story. But I I started realizing that there was so much in that box that I had packed away and making it
Yeah.
so heavy that it was, becoming kind of this overwhelming burden
Yeah.
in my life, that I felt like I couldn't kind of move forward unless
Yeah.
I stopped and opened that box and looked back. And
Yeah.
so that was kind of what prompted the start of this MFA program and starting to write into this experience.
Yeah.
But again, I had no idea how difficult it was going to be. I had no idea kind of the psychological toll that it was going
Yeah.
to take. I found myself very much re-traumatized, and I think in some ways traumatized for the first time, because I hadn't really faced it or articulated it. I was too young to articulate it at
Yeah.
certain parts,
Yeah.
and so I had a lot of moments kind of in the writing where, and I'm sure you found this in writing your own story, that you kind of feel like if I keep going, I'm going to disintegrate, I'm going to
Yeah.
be gone. And which is what prompted actually my first book. I ended up writing a book called Writing Hard Stories.
Yeah.
I interviewed 18 contemporary memoirists
Mm.
who had written stories of trauma, because I really wanted to know, like, how did they get to the point where they were able to keep writing their story without disintegrating,
Speaking
and
of which, did you, I forgive my ignorance, but is that a context in which you interviewed our mutual friend Tia, or did she come along later?
no, that was later. That was later, but I
Okay.
did interview our mutual friend Andre Dubusse III.
Yeah.
Um, so that's when I first met
Well,
Andre.
Andre is godfather to my grandchildren, and
Oh,
vice
is he?
versa. Jeannie and I are godparents to some of his
Yeah,
kids as well. So
yeah,
that's a good connect. We're connected
yeah.
on a lot of levels
I
here.
know. Andre's become a good friend. But
Yeah.
I needed to write that book and talk to those writers who had done the work, to hear
Yeah.
them say, like, there comes a point in the process where it doesn't feel as hard. There comes
Sure.
a point where you start seeing beyond your own story to the story that might be speaking to other people.
Yes,
And there
exactly.
comes a point where it feels good to be putting it on the page. And,
Yes,
in
exactly.
talking to those writers for my first book, I then kind of, that was what kept me going
Yeah.
with writing hard, with A Hard Silence, because I I didn't know if I could get to the place where I
Yeah.
could put the story down in the
Mm.
pages and be okay, but eventually I did. And what they told me came true, that
I
you write
totally
it.
get it. And I
Yeah,
want to, because I'm 72, I'm going to ask this question instead of forgetting it or making a note, so I'll forget it. And then I'm going to reintroduce you and do all that stuff I'm supposed to do,
sure.
get you to hold your book up. But let me ask this question first. And this is just sort of writer to writer, because we brought up Andre in the process. And I remember Andre, when he started writing Townie, came to me because Crazy for God had come out, and he'd read that and liked it. And he's been someone following my work for a while. So he asked for some advice, not as a writer, because he's a great writer. He doesn't need any advice, but in terms of how to put himself on the page and what not to say in
Mhm.
terms of his father's memory and his mother and his rather complicated family. And I told him, I said, the big lesson for me in writing memoirs is to write the first draft as if no one except you will ever read it. Don't
Yeah,
start editing yourself, thinking, what will so and so think? And will my mom be hurt if I tell this story? And what do I owe my brother or my sister, whatever? Just put it all down, because second, third, fourth, fifth drafts, you can come back and then use before you spoil your story by editing yourself. Okay, that's part one. Part two, I've learned something in my writing that I want to share with you and then ask you if you've had a similar experience. And now this is where it's going to sound weird. And it really fits your story. So figure out why I'm asking this. I have found in my own writing that there are things which I'm hesitant to talk about, but that I find I can write about as long as I think to myself, no one will read this but me for a while. And then once it's done, you're thinking, I don't mind telling that story. Keeping family secrets is one of those things. So you from 13 on were keeping this family secret.
yeah,
I, from younger than that on, was keeping the family secret about my father's character in terms of how he treated my mother, which was abusive at times. And yet we carried that with us forever, because it will hurt the Lord's work And my mother became his facilitator, as in, I could talk to her and she would tell me what my dad was doing sometimes, but we're not talking about that because the Lord's work is more important.
Mhm.
And I'd never been able to talk about that at all and still find it tough to talk about. But I found that I could write it. And then in writing it, it changed my own view of myself and the business of keeping secrets. So I know that's very convoluted. I think you're going to understand what I was trying to ask you.
Absolutely.
How does that resonate with you?
Well, I certainly say the same thing to my memoir students that, you do kind of have to write. And I think most of us start writing these kinds of stories, not because we think we're writing a book for a wider audience, but because we're
Right.
trying to understand the story for ourselves. The quote that I have from Andre in Writing Hard Stories is he said, we all know what happened, but we
Yeah.
start writing to figure out what the hell happened, right?
Yes, exactly.
So we're doing that
Hmm.
initially just to try to make sense of it for
Yeah.
ourselves. But I think in that process of making sense for it, the story becomes something different for us in many
Yeah.
ways. Like I know for me, you know, I wrote with some anger at the beginning that is no
Yeah.
longer part of this story.
Yeah.
With I interviewed another writer. His name is Gerald Walker, and he talked about that in writing his book. He
Hmm.
kind of rescued his parents from
Yes.
falling off
Yes.
the precipice, in the sense.
Yeah.
So I certainly struggled with what to include and what not to include. And I
Yeah.
took advice from a lot of different writers on that. One of the things that was really difficult for me to decide whether to write about or not was my dad's homophobia,
Yeah. Yeah.
because you worry, right? Like you worry
Sure.
that a reader is just going to latch onto one thing and
Yeah.
not
Now
see the bigger
you put
picture
it
of the
out there
story.
and so
Right.
forth. And it's
Yeah.
always hard too when someone's dead because they're not around to defend
To defend
themselves.
themselves, right? But I also realized, my dad was a human being. He had his
Yeah.
flaws. And and knowing that piece of the story is an
Yeah.
important piece in understanding the secret keeping, and so
Apropos of which, let's revisit this after I reintroduce you, which I'm
sure.
supposed to do. But I just want to make sure we get back to something, and that is this secret you had to keep for all these years that then stuck with you way beyond what you would have imagined. Um, how was that rooted in his homophobia and sense of shame about something he shouldn't have been ashamed of? I want to
Right.
don't hold that thought for a
Okay.
second while I say
I
I'm in
will.
conversation with Frank Schaeffer. That's me. My guest is Melanie Brooks, and she's written this incredible book. That we are talking about now that I want you to hold up again, Melanie, because I don't have a hard copy here. And it's called A Hard Silence. And it basically tells the story of how her father got AIDS through a blood transfusion, the shame he felt. And this is what we're going to get back to here in a minute for two reasons. One, because people really did look down on and bully the gay community. But then he had this several double whammy of homophobia. So it's like, not only do I want to keep this secret, and forgive me if I'm putting words in your mouth, because I don't want to be one of those people William F. Buckley wants to tattoo in vengeance for being gay, and I'm not gay. But in addition to which, I happen to be anti-gay myself, which is what he was basically where he's coming from. So A Hard Silence is a really wonderful book, and I've read that with great love and interest. I'm hoping you'll allow us to make it part of our book club. It has to be read as a book club we do, and Ernie will text me and tell me
I'd love that.
when it can be. If you want, it has to be read in December. It would be at our December offering.
That'd be perfect because December 1st is, World AIDS Day. So that'd
Yeah,
be
so that would fit
nice.
well.
Mhm.
And I'm going to say, please subscribe right now on YouTube. You're listening live to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and also to Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack, it has to be said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And we are making this book our December offering. And we will be revisiting it and maybe getting you back on a panel or something to
That'd be
further
wonderful.
push it there. I had an interesting experience as a filmmaker in Hollywood, and then we're going to get back to the book. But I have a point of reference that brought me into your story. Everybody finds their own path into a story, and mine was, we share that evangelical background, your father's homophobia, my own views and how they've changed our journey, and so forth. And we've talked about it. But another point of reference was this, and that is, how sometimes thinking back into the 1970s and 80s when people were very, very anti-gay and anti-everything to do with gay people. I was in such a community as that, although my parents were very kind to people who came to the L'Abri Fellowship, they kind of were better than their theology, if I can put it that way. But a huge break came for me in terms of my own thinking on this. And that is, I became very good friends with an actor by the name of Merritt Buttrick, who I owe an eternal apology to, because when I was just getting into the Hollywood end of the film business and directing really shitty third-rate action and slasher films, because I had to earn my living somehow and literally didn't know how to do anything except make movies, because I'd been raised in the evangelical world and I write about that. Merritt was gay, but he was gay at a time when you didn't talk about being gay, which was in his, given his background, he was, had not really come out. And this was in the early 1980s. And we made this movie together called Wired to Kill in 1985. And Merritt had been in the Star Trek movies, and he had done various things, but never could have made it big. And I wish I had put him in a better movie. But anyway, Merritt and I became quite close because he was the only really good actor in the picture and deserved better. And after we had become close, he gradually started to tell me very obliquely that he was gay, and then got AIDS. And he was the first person I knew with what was then being called gay cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And coincidentally, I used to have tea with William F. Buckley, just to drop crazy names here, on the porch of my father's Swiss chalet, because Buckley had a chalet in Gstaad and would come over the hill for a half-hour drive and have tea with us. Back in the day when we were all, and that includes my younger nepotistic sidekick asshole self, reactionary right-wingers.
Right.
But my friendship with Merritt began to break that down, in that I got to know him as an actor and respect him as a human being. And now my friend Merritt is dead and dying and telling me, you know, I have gay cancer, not because he wouldn't say the words AIDS, but nobody knew what we were doing, what it was then.
Yeah.
And that's really part of my journey out of the evangelical background, because, excuse the language here, it was like if I had to choose between you assholes on the 700 Club and Jerry Falwell and these other guys I know, or this talented, beautiful human being called Merritt Buttrick, who died on me young.
Yeah.
It was a beginning of a journey, like, you know, whatever line he was in, I would rather have been in.
Sure.
And so it's odd, because my own story has a direct intersection in my own change of heart and mind as someone in my mid-20s.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't just, you'll change your mind on being gay when your son or your daughter turns out to be a lesbian or whatever, but it's like this one person you respect more than anyone else on this shitty movie project you're making, who has become a real and close friend, is telling you something he's not telling anybody else.
Right.
So
Well, I have
he's
a big
telling me,
brother.
I've got to leave the set early today. I'm sick. And then I'm starting to visit him in Cedar Sinai. And we are real buddies. And he has a disease he doesn't want me to tell anybody about, because he says I'll be blacklisted, which he would have been.
Yeah.
And so, you know, do I touch him? Could I catch it? You know, this is back when it's the boogeyman.
Right.
And that's a formative experience for me. And I know I've gone on too long about it, but I just want to call out my old friend Merritt Buttrick and just say, Merritt, I'm really sorry, man. I'm really sorry.
Yeah.
I should have put you in a better movie, and forgive me for being such an asshole. I
I
would
think,
like to go back and hug him.
well, I think all of us, kind of look back at that time of ignorance and fear when no one knew what was happening,
Yeah,
right? And I think in some ways we have to be forgiving to ourselves, in the same way we
yeah,
have to be forgiving to the fact that we wiped down our groceries, during COVID, and that
yeah,
we, wouldn't touch anything that anybody else had touched. And, I think we have to, kind of forgive on some levels based on just what wasn't known. But I think when it became known and people continued to carry that stigma, I think
yeah,
that's what becomes intolerant, and that's what becomes unforgivable. I have a gay brother, and for me, watching that evolution in our family, right? He's married, he has a son, their family is as legitimate as any other family.
sure,
And to
absolutely.
hear people from a community that I used to be deeply embedded in trying to negate the legitimacy of their family, you have to start questioning, right?
Yeah,
And you know, I've watched the evolution of my mother, who has, you know, who came from the same background as my father, and I have to believe that my father's evolution would have followed the same track, you
yeah,
know.
one hopes, one
Yeah,
hopes.
right. And you know, because I know above all, he loved my brother, you know,
Yeah,
and so I think you come to those places where you have to interrogate, you know, what you've grown up with. And part
yeah,
of writing this book, you know, kind of my crisis of faith didn't happen until really I started writing this book, because
yeah,
I think I've heard you talk about that, you know, you kind of put on that persona in the evangelical world, even if you're not
yes,
sure it's part of
sure.
you or just what you've been conditioned to do, you know, and I did that for so many years. But
Yeah,
when I actually started really trying to interrogate, you know, the roots of the silence in our family, the roots of the stigma of this disease, the roots of the
yeah,
secrecy, I had to start interrogating, you know, the faith community that I had been brought up in and that I had
yeah.
been a part of. And, you know, it was a deep kind of, um, it created kind of a deep chasm in my life,
Yeah.
because I
And I
recognized, you
Yeah,
know.
absolutely. And I think one of the things that you may have experienced as well, and by the way, just to give the context of what we're talking about, in a feature piece in the fall of 1985, and this is from your book, Time Magazine called People with AIDS the New Untouchables. Well, as a matter of fact, 1985 is when I was with Merritt in the hospital, um, visiting him all the time. Inconsistent and conflicting messages of how HIV spread made people afraid of even coming into contact with someone infected with the virus. When one child in a New York City school was identified as having AIDS, crowds of parents picketed the streets of New York wearing shirts reading "No AIDS in our schools." And that sort of is the flavor of the time. Um, Shame on us. That's where we were. But I just want to say, you know, my change of heart took sort of the path was similar to yours, but a little different in the sense that knowing Merritt well and loving Merritt very dearly, and Merritt and I struggling to make a good movie out of something that was, you know, not just a sow's ear, but we were never going to make a purse. But um, every bit of his film, if you cut a trailer just of Merritt's bits, it could have been out of a great film. But anyway, what was interesting is sometimes you have an emotional reaction to kind of bigotry,
Mhm.
but in my case, the emotion came first because of my fondness for Merritt, but soon followed by the science. And that was really beginning to understand I have been conditioned to believe a lie. This
Mhm.
is false information. Fast forward to the present moment, and I don't want to throw you in at the deep end, but when I look at the MAGA movement and Trump, this is exactly what has happened. And that is they
Yeah.
have transposed their conspiracy theorism and their lack of facticity and the fact they believe Genesis instead of evolution, and they believe that gay people don't you know, are not quote normal, but somehow choose a lifestyle, on
Right.
and on and on and on and on. The challenge is not just to emotionally change our point of view, it's to understand that the reason we have an emotional reaction if we have a shred of compassion
Right.
isn't related to morality or being good people. It's related to actual fact and science.
Mhm.
You know, Merritt never chose to be gay. Merritt's gay in the same way that I'm heterosexual.
Right.
You know, this wasn't God's judgment on Merritt, you know, any more than I spent the morning at a periodontist who's working on an infection in a tooth of mine, and the root and fixing it with laser therapy is a judgment on me because I've left the evangelical fold. You
Right.
know, you wake up one morning and you say, well, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. I'm not being emotional and kind here. I'm just getting my worldview. I'm ripping these spectacles off and I'm looking at what's really there.
Yeah.
And it's not a series of God-driven conspiracies. And I find that about your book. You know, I really think that's a subtext of your book, if I
Well, it
can put
is.
it
And,
that
you
way.
know, one of the fears I had in writing this book in some ways is, you know, people often talk about my dad and others like him as being, quote, innocent victims, right? That
Mm-hmm.
they somehow, you know, they got this disease through no fault of their own, right? I've never wanted to position my dad in that place of being more heroic or
Yeah.
being special in some way, because, people are the ones who discriminate. Viruses cannot,
Yes.
viruses do not have the power to discriminate. And so it
Yeah.
was really important that that not be anything that kind of underrode the writing of this book. And
Exactly.
however, in April, I published a piece in the HuffPost that went a little bit viral, and it got, elevated to Yahoo News. And sadly, I made the mistake of reading some of the comments. There were probably 850 comments on Yahoo,
Yes.
and none of them were against me or against my dad, but it was all of those voices that continue to kind of perpetuate this idea, like, look who we have to blame for what happened to this poor family. Look
Yeah.
what and I almost wanted to write a follow-up to apologize for having
Yeah.
kind of unleashed those voices in
Yeah.
many ways. But that's the thing, people are easily convinced when you scare them,
Yeah.
right? You make them afraid of something, and
Yeah.
you choose something for them to be afraid of. And that's what we keep seeing in our culture right
Yeah.
now.
And I think basically you understand the MAGA movement through the lens of the same thing, in that we as human beings have not evolved to a point where our minds can handle what we have become. And so we look for quote unquote reasons all the time to explain something. And those reasons can be completely fictitious. And in fact, there's a part of your book that I'm just going to read here that kind of is about that. You're fortunate you can talk about your father, Peg said, letting go of my hand, her tone recalibrating, hardening once more. At least he can't be blamed for what happened to him. There's nothing you have to be ashamed about. And then you say, the implication of her words hit me with such force, I took an involuntary step backward. You are such a good writer.
Thank you.
Yes. And I
Yeah, that
just,
was an encounter I had with a woman at a church I was attending, and I
yeah,
was actually asked to give a talk on World AIDS Day in
yeah,
church. And so I spoke about it, and I spoke a little bit about,
sure.
a little bit from my parents' book. And this was a woman in our church who came up to me after and very kind of hush hush said, my son
Mhm.
died of AIDS. And then, went on this whole story of, what, but at least you don't have to be ashamed. And it
Yeah,
brought so close kind of that idea
yeah,
of who we assign blame to, who we say should be ashamed of things and who
yeah,
shouldn't, and it just hit home for me, just the sad state of things that we've done that.
yeah, exactly. And I think your book is sort of a catalyst for that whole discussion. In other words, this applies to so many areas of life.
Right.
Um, and one thing I just want to go to here again, more toward the end of your book, is why did I hold this grief so close? Why did my wounds refuse to heal? I love that line, by the way. Um, why did I carry this trauma everywhere when my brothers seem to have left it somewhere behind them? And I just want to throw that open to your current interpretation, not quoting from your book, but hearing from you, because I want to ask you that question, not as in, well, why did you do this? I don't understand, but just to open a door to who you are and to understand your book better. So why?
Well, I think one thing, we all process, and I think this is part of what has come out of writing this book is, I wanted everybody in my family to be processing this grief and this story in the same way.
Yes.
And we all process trauma differently. And I think we
Yeah.
have to make space for how people process trauma. I mean, my oldest brother is the president and CEO of World Vision Canada, one of the key
Yeah.
organizations that have worked with AIDS communities, one of the first evangelical organizations
Sure.
to ever address the AIDS crisis in Africa.
Yeah.
Two of my brothers are doctors, and they've
And by the way, one of the reasons President Bush Jr. got involved with helping AIDS patients all over the world was because of some of the evangelicals in World Vision that I
right.
personally knew, who went to him and said, we got to do something.
Right. Yeah. And so I I want I've kind of come to a place where I've been able to give space for how they've processed it, but I've also come to understand who I am. And I'm
Yeah.
somebody who holds things very tightly and very close, and
Yeah.
memories stay with me. And I need to make sense of those. And I need
Yeah.
to make sense of them in a way that isn't just for me. And I think that's what I really started understanding about this story that I was writing,
Yeah.
that, while our family circumstances are particularly unique, the
Yes.
the grief I experienced in losing my dad is not unique.
Yeah. Yeah.
Suffering in silence is not unique.
Yeah.
Family secrets are not unique.
Yeah.
And, I wanted to write this in a sense that maybe other people who are not at a place where they're able to reveal the
Yeah.
secrets or what they've carried in silence might
Yeah.
feel less alone. Because I think part of what I recognized, I had this weird grieving experience during COVID when we all isolated, right?
Sure.
Because it made me like kind of the communal global effort of that
Yeah.
felt like such a contrast to my family's isolation in the 1980s. And I kept thinking, like, what would it have been like if everybody had been a part of this with us, and if
Yeah.
everybody, and I kind of had this weird grief for myself back then, but I recognize, we need support. We need to be taking care of each other, whatever
Yeah.
the circumstances are. And, that's part of the story that I needed to write.
Yeah, and it comes through very, very clearly, but I would take it a step further, and I don't mean to disagree with you, but I would just tell people listening to this that I know this will sound funny, not funny, amusing, but strange. But the real reason to read Melanie Brooks' book is not because it will help you or her story will affect other people, as if somehow this isn't a reason to read this is because of the good it will do. The real reason to read this is it's a goddamn good book. And that's my view of art. We don't sit down and say, what should I paint today? What should I write today? From the point of view of, I have something to say. Later, we figure out what we said and we think, oh, well, maybe it'll help somebody in a similar situation. But we write it for our own reasons. And if we're a good writer like you are, the project is worthwhile in and of itself. It has intrinsic value because of the beauty of the writing. And this is a book worth reading. Doesn't, whether it does you any good or not is a different question. I think it will, because it tells things that are true, and that's truth is always good for anybody. But if I may add my 10 cents worth, the reason to read Melanie's book is because it's a brilliantly written, beautiful piece of work, period.
Well, thank you. This is a book that took me 10 years to write, really.
I can tell.
It
Of
was
course
10
it
years
did.
from the time I started until I published it. And,
Yep.
I mean, that's a deep compliment to hear from you, Frank, and I really appreciate it,
Yeah.
because we want to know that we've made something
You have.
beautiful, right?
Yeah.
Out of whatever the circumstances are we're
Yeah.
writing about. And we want to know that, our words have meaning at that level as
Yeah.
well.
But I
This is
think if you want your work to exist in the future, it has to be art in the true sense of the word. And you've written a work of art, so it's going to be around for a long time. And I have a question to ask you,
Sure.
apropos of which, in terms of the writer process, but also just the book. And that is when it seems to me when you look at the kind of journey that you and I have been on and the similarities of this journey from this evangelical background. Let's take merit. There are steps in the same way that you realize, hey, I want to be on the side of fact and science.
Right.
If you look at World Vision's good-heartedness towards the gay community, it does not begin or end in what I would call the right place. And I don't mean a criticism of that individual ministry, nor does the Roman Catholic churches when it comes to helping people, nor did my parents' view of art really jive with my worldview today. My father was unique. I just talked to a woman this morning who's moving from Switzerland to the States. We had a lovely chat because she's looking for a school for her kids and I'm helping her out. And we were talking about the irony. It depends where you start from. She was in this incredibly closed, crazy Pentecostal group up in way flung far away from anywhere in Oregon. And it was my parents' work to her family. My parents were the liberals because they were interested in art. They were interested in culture, and it opened doors for her. And now she's journeyed further. So it all depends. Well, where do you begin? But what I'm trying to say here is that the evangelical vision of charity toward, let us say, gay people or AIDS sufferers. The good evangelicals are kind because they think Jesus wants them to be kind, because that way we can reach someone. And we've got a witness for God, and it's going to be our responsibility, people quote, get saved. And so let's act like we're decent and more decent than, say, other Christians who are harsher. But in the end, it's not a rethink of what we think about homosexuality, period, paragraph.
Exactly.
And
exactly. I
so,
mean, that whole
it's it.
mantra,
Yeah,
I write about this, the whole, hate the sin, love the sinner,
yeah.
right?
And
I
that's,
mean,
yeah, yeah. And basically it refuses to deal with the fact that my point of view these days is completely the opposite. And that is that homosexuality is absolutely as normal as heterosexuality. It is as decent. And for my gay friends to be anything but who they are would be as bad as for me to go fuck around when I'm married and supposed to be kind and faithful to my wife, Jeannie. It would be a dereliction of
right,
your commitment to who you are.
right.
And so, I'm not kind to my grandchildren because I want them to take care of me in my old age. There is no ulterior motive. It's the right thing to do. And I
It, right.
regard the view of being gay, and it isn't like, let's be kind to people who are different. Apropos of which, and this is my question to you, because you've thought about this, it used to be at a time that I would read passages by St. Paul, for instance, in the Bible, or other people on women being silent
Right.
or homosexually being bad, and you would fish around and say, well, that's not really what he meant because it's balanced by another statement somewhere else. And I've come to a very different conclusion. Yeah, it's exactly what he meant.
Yeah.
And they were wrong. And they were wrong because the science says something different. Deal with it. Sorry, your religion is full of shit. And you either have to tell the truth about this or forever embrace a sort of a conspiracy theory of the universe where somehow all of this fiction is true. You can't have it both ways.
Right.
And I really am at a very different place than a lot of my progressive evangelical friends who are still, I think, mealy mouthed about just saying, no, fuck this. We are
Yeah.
done here. This is wrong. This is the flat earth. This is blaming plague sufferers for, they didn't sniff enough fresh apples that would
Right.
have purified the air. This is bullshit. The
Yeah.
science is something totally different. And I must say, I've come to that position starting at an emotional place, but now just one where you honor the facts of existence and you
And
say,
I'm
yep,
100%, I'm 100% with you. That's
yeah,
exactly where I have landed. And I believe very strongly that the church is going to look back at this time period, maybe 20, 30, 40, 50 years
sure.
ago, in the same way that the church looks at how they discussed interracial couples. I think it's going to be, I think that this shame of
Yeah,
lack of accepting that, somebody who's gay is equally beautiful in the eyes of God as someone who is not. I think this shame is going to follow the church, and it's going, that was kind of the root of what made us walk away from our
yeah,
church community, was that there was this split happening right
yeah,
over it. And it suddenly made me realize, somebody is going to well-meaningly, with good
yeah,
intentions, teach my kids that they shouldn't love their uncles,
yeah,
right? Or that they
exactly.
should tolerate their uncles, but they should
Mhm.
feel, ashamed of them. And I recognize, like, that is nothing that I want to be a part of. That is
Right.
not anything that I want to be associated with. And, I think that's what's hard. And I don't know if you've found this as well, of kind of attaching to Christianity,
Hmm.
because the umbrella of Christianity reaches over to such terrible
Yeah,
intolerance, right? And it's kind of like, how do I say I'm part of this thing that those people are part of, right? How
yeah,
do I say we're part of this same faith,
yeah,
and I don't want, I always kind of want to be like, I'm not that kind of Christian, but
yeah.
I don't know if you've found that too in this kind of
Yeah,
middle
very
place
much so. And I
you're in.
think part of the journey is to start telling the truth about history, and that
Mhm.
is come clean.
Right.
Jeannie and I right now we're listening to a book on, audio books. We listen to a lot of history and biography together, and we're listening to a very good biography of Catherine de' Medici. Well, if you think the church, whether Protestant or Roman Catholic, in the 15th and 16th centuries, as they developed in France and in Switzerland, was in good shape, it's encouraging in the sense that they were as screwed up as we are.
Mhm.
It's discouraging because it's just like, where have I seen all this before? The
Right.
superstition, the myths, the conspiracy theories, MAGA, Trump, the King of France. It's all one picture. And at some point, people like you and me, and I know I'm preaching here, but we've got to step up and just say, look, if you're following Jesus, you can't be like this.
Right.
And B, I don't follow Jesus anymore. What I do is follow what evolution teaches, which is the same lesson that Jesus teaches, which is it's not the survival of the fittest, it's the survival of the friendliest. It's cooperation that is the only reason we're here talking.
Right.
Somebody stopped by a roadside and helped my great great ancestor that had a broken femur and bound it up and took him to their village. And that's why I'm here. Same with you. We all, somewhere in our history, there's some compassion or we're all gone.
Right.
And simply that is to me a reflection of the actual human history. So I think it's a chaos and it's mess, but it's punctuated by moments of enlightenment, sometimes by a Christian who thinks they're following Jesus, sometimes by a secular person who's following science. But it seems to me that in terms that my nonfiction calls people to, is to recognize that the real driving force behind evolution and survival is the survival of the friendliest. It's reaching out to people. And
Well,
I
and you
found in
think
my own
about,
life that makes a difference.
well, and think about, it doesn't, kind of that fear and stigma and, willingness to scapegoat, right? Doesn't just exist within the evangelical Christian
No,
community,
it's
right?
everywhere.
Like I think that my book has resonance post-COVID because
Absolutely.
we saw so many echoes of what was happening in the early days of the AIDS crisis at the very beginning of COVID, right?
Well,
That,
and the human instinct to do that, it just keeps
right,
replicating. So,
exactly,
1 minute you're protesting in favor of Palestinian autonomy, and the next minute, you're banning Jews from your campus. It's always exclusionary.
right,
And the big lesson of history is that, look, been here before, we've all done this. And, you can tell something is a youthful movement when they kind of label something like colonization as if the only people that did it ever were Israel or us. There is no part of the world that wasn't colonized by someone, whether it was killing all the indigenous species,
right.
when humans, the human race is a fucking disaster. And into that disaster, there are moments of light. And one of the moments of light is Melanie's book. Read it.
Thank you.
How do you like that for a wrap up?
That's a good wrap up. That's a good wrap up. But I
And
mean, I
I
do
love
want
your
to
book.
say thank you. I
Yeah.
do want to say part of the reason that I wrote this book is because there's an entire generation that does not know this history.
No, they don't know the
We're not that
story.
far removed.
No.
This was 40 years ago that
Yeah.
this was happening. And there are so many people who know nothing about what
Yeah.
this was like. And so part of the reason was to keep that history alive because we learn from it too.
Yeah. And as we said at the beginning of this talk, the history is very vivid when it comes to the United Kingdom because they did the same thing.
Right.
Tainted
Right.
blood supply. And they're only now, 40 years later, finally starting to
And
get
finally,
settlements.
right,
And
that op-ed that I
ironically,
wrote.
yeah,
Yeah,
and half
the
those people
op-ed
are
that
dead.
I wrote was about, this report that came out doesn't change what happened, but it
Yeah.
does change the fact that now their stories are finally being heard,
Yeah.
after so long.
Well, and in a way, it's your story, but in another way, your book is so much bigger than that, that the history is sort of like an added benefit. In addition to reading a wonderful book, you get a chance to actually catch up on a little known facet of Canadian and also North American and British and French history related to AIDS, but then related to the whole topic of exclusion.
Right, right.
So there couldn't be anything more, you get a history lesson of something you didn't know about before you read this book. You get an anthropological and sociological guide to the human race as seen through one lens, but that has truth about a lot of other things. And you also get a really brilliantly written book, which is the reason to read it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Hey, listen, stay online here with
Okay.
Ernie. Talk to him about another guest we could get or guests, discuss the details of you being in our book club. And Melanie, literally, I reach through the screen and I kiss your hand and I thank you for writing a brilliant book.
Thank you, Frank. Thanks so much for talking with me.
Yeah, it's a wonderful read.
Thank you.
It's really, really terrific. So well done, okay?
Thank you so much.